Jackie.
To echo that as well, I've heard a lot of people in their introductions already, people who haven't necessarily joined these conversations before, echo a lot of the conversations that have gone into creating this session. Things around how can we be really genuine in the way that we're communicating? How can we connect with communities? How can we engage more people? How can we look at systems change and creating bigger shifts? So we've got some new faces here. We've got some faces that we know very well. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. You're all very welcome. Just to reiterate what this session was designed for, this session came out of discussions with our community and community calls, specifically from the perspective of grassroots regenerative practitioners, people who are operating in their local contexts. This is an area that people feel that there's always not enough time, and storytelling is something that people always want to improve on. So that's kind of where we're coming from with this session. As we'll explain more in a minute, we want to, as James mentioned, talk through some principles of what we consider our approach to storytelling and ethical storytelling. And we're not necessarily delivering training. This is really a workshop, an exploratory session together. And I would just like to say, I know that some people are on their phones, some people are digging. And we're all in very different situations right now, but just to give you a heads up, we do have some interactive elements in this. So a few questions that we may ask you to write in the chat, or maybe to verbalize your answer briefly. And we are hoping to have a little breakout room session as well as some times for reflection and maybe jotting down some ideas about ways that you can frame your work. So I'm just flagging that up now in case you want to get a pen and a piece of paper, or just to prepare you for that. I also wanted to use this opportunity to say that Realliance, as an organization, we believe in these values, and we're always trying to improve our storytelling too, including platforming the voices of those who we believe should be leading the movement, those who are most affected by the kind of things that we're talking about. So you can see, as we've put as the background of this slide, we've been really fortunate to be able to support some short films by some of our members that we've worked with. And the still that you're seeing at the moment is from a film that's going to be released on our YouTube channel later this month. So we have a few other storytelling and communications projects in the works. So keep an eye out on that. And as with all of us, this is all a work in progress as well. So I think that's enough introduction from me, and we'll kick off into the session. So with the slides that we've put together, just as a starting point to get some of the conversations going and to bring some perspectives, we thought that we'd use this session to start framing how we can define our message. What's a message that we want to tell in our stories? What fits with our work? What fits with our worldview? So some people already mentioned, looking at decolonizing and embracing regeneration, and how can we work that into the brief, impactful communications that we're trying to share. We're going to look into some mediums and platforms that might be best suited to the specific story that you're trying to tell. And we've included some discussion points and some tips around shaping your story in terms of design, whether it's visual, written, audio, or something else. So here are some topics that we're going to explore together.
Thanks so much, Jackie. So as we mentioned, we have been kind of exploring in discussion with members over the past few years, storytelling from a regenerative perspective. So we thought we'd just give a brief overview of some wisdom that we harvested from that group. Something that we noticed is that regenerative stories are always rooted down here. You can see the roots in regenerative paradigms, so regenerative ways of being, but also including and being shaped by the principles from living systems, so nature-inspired principles and practice, as well as core ethics of regeneration. So stories, and we hope today that we can show you a process that can help guide and help root stories in a way that it is regenerative. Like Jackie said, we're then going to kind of shape the story in a way that is unique. So through this process, we hope that you'll be able to find a story that is unique to you and giving your own unique perspective, but also finding a way through kind of mapping your audience of a way that is finding a relevance for your audience. So finding your own uniqueness, but also finding your unique audience and tailoring the story to them. We always hope that regenerative stories are accessible. So we, throughout this process, are going to find ways to identify key messages that we want people to take away from our stories, and also making it clear and easy to understand, while also leaving space for the richness and complexity that always comes with regenerative work. You know, it's not necessarily always simple to share. And then, kind of like Deepa said before, how do we deepen into this transformational element of stories? So, as we're sharing stories, how can we also grow the capacity of the audience in the process of sharing the story? How do we help people grow through the stories that we tell and the ways that we tell them? What is it that people can learn? And what are the transformational leverage points? How can we help shape and change and grow and transform belief and also practice and behavior through storytelling? So, this is some of the grounding through which we'll work today. And the way that we're going to do this, we'll introduce in a moment through this design process, which you can see on the right. So on the right, you can see a design process that we'll deepen into together throughout this workshop. But we also wanted to just introduce some of the principles that we mentioned here, seeing as regenerative stories are always rooted in nature-inspired principles. So we just thought we'd pop some here. We're going to share this deck afterwards, so I'm not going to deepen into them right now, but this can be a bit of a worksheet for you afterwards if you would like. So we're going to structure this workshop around a regenerative design process, because of course, in this idea of regeneration, we place ourselves as the designers, acknowledging that we have the capacities to help shape the world around us. It's an empowering process of design. And this is the way that we have structured it, starting with visioning. So how can you vision with your community to help shape stories? What is it that you need to observe? How do you integrate these together to create rich and transformational stories? Always thinking about how your stories might grow and evolve over time, and then the best ways to share your story. And of course, this is a design process which is usually applied to other spaces, for example, permaculture design in land-based work or community design. So it's kind of a bit interesting and strange that we're applying this to creating stories. And I hope you like it. Your thoughts are very welcome, though. So this is the process, and we're going to deepen into it now. Any questions before we move on? I'm sure questions may emerge. So, Jackie, why does storytelling matter?
So we thought we'd kick off by, really embracing and imagining why storytelling matters. If you imagine different ways that you've received information, what makes a story different from just any piece of information? I think that stories resonate with our lived experiences. There's often, stories often tell a person's perspective, and you can resonate with that and you can identify and empathize and learn in that way. Stories go beyond communicating facts, they engage or challenge beliefs. Good stories help people explore ideas in ways that are accessible. Stories are often really useful for bridging maybe cultural barriers, language barriers, even educational understanding barriers. Really complex ideas can often be communicated really effectively through a simple story. And stories in these ways can really engage people with not just their heads, but their hearts and hopefully their hands and prompt action. So this is why we think it's something really relevant to talk about in our work. And just another kind of grounding point on that. just think for a moment when we are talking about stories, the difference between learning the science behind what makes a berry poisonous to humans compared to a story of what happened when someone ate that poisonous berry. I think this kind of framing is quite useful when a lot of our work on things like regeneration and land-based work is linked to things that some people consider scientific and far away, like climate breakdown. Is it more useful to talk about degrees of climate change and things like this, or what is happening to a family on the ground? So we just wanted to kind of start by broadening our minds like this. And I invite you all to think for a moment of a story, any story, whether it's related to your work, whether it was a film you watched. Think of a story that impacted you and what made it memorable. How did it make you feel? Did it move you to act? So I'll invite you to reflect on this in a moment. And then in the next slide, we'll invite you to share in the chat as well. So a story that you found really powerful was blank, and it made you feel blank. So whether you want to share this in the chat or you'd rather this be a personal reflection, I'll give you 2 minutes to think about this, maybe write it down, maybe put it in the chat. So a story I found really powerful was blank. It made me feel blank. So another moment in case anyone else would like to share. We've got 2 in the chat already. Okay. Ooh, we annotating. Okay, so I think if we're all, after taking that moment of engaging with that story, even just remembering it, you might find that some of those initial feelings that are prompted are still alive in you. Um, and such a range of examples and just the few that are shared in the chat. We've got people feeling hopeful, energized, horrible, deeply sad.
It's so interesting seeing this range of emotion. And for me, this really speaks to the fact that stories can change us. Stories can really impact us so deeply if we
Mm.
craft the stories meaningfully.
And even I find it interesting, even just reading Leticia's note in the chat, I feel impacted by that story already.
Mm.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing all of these. Mm. Jean-Michel, that's an interesting one that can provoke so many emotions at once, happy yet deeply sad, angered but hopeful. Feel the weight of degenerative relational patterns of humans. So many complex impacts and feelings can be generated from some stories. And some of these stories as well are ranging from full feature-length films to a conversation with somebody, which I think is really interesting to reflect on as well. Mm, mm. I think that this has been a really beautiful grounding exercise as well, because a lot of the stories that have been shared are all tied in some way into the changes that we're all in community and trying to make. So I feel quite energized from reading all of those as well. So maybe we'll move
Mm,
on to the next slide. So
thank you so much for that activity. Yeah, I completely agree. It's a really interesting way that it came out that this is a lot of the motivation for our work is emerging through the stories that we listen to and the feelings that we get from the stories we engage with. So I'd love to invite you to think again for a moment to envision what storytelling could achieve in your work. So, thinking on these powerful emotions that have emerged from the stories that you've heard, how might you use storytelling as a tool for highlighting and showing the work and also inspiring others through the work that you do? A question that we would love to engage you on is, why am I telling this story? And what do I want my audience to do afterwards? And this is a really important thing to begin with in this initial visioning stage, which, by the way, you can do individually as an individual reflection, or also collaboratively with community, which is really rich as well. Uh, And why this is important now is because these questions will help us shape everything that emerges herein. So why am I telling this story? Why am I the person to tell this story? And what do I want my audience to do? From then on, this will help us shape and grow the story as we go further through the
mm,
process. Jackie, anything else to add?
I don't think so. I was just jotting down my own answers.
Oh, great. Well, I'll give you all a moment to do that. So
Actually,
think of us.
one thing I will add is for the purpose of the session, let's try in your mind create a story. So maybe this is the point at which you've been trying to communicate about your work, but maybe we identify a goal, because I'm sure we all want to achieve all these goals. And perhaps through the course of this workshop, you may feel that you formed a story, whatever format that might take. So try and create a specific thing in mind. And also, potentially, if you do create a story, we would love to platform your story in the Reliance Network as well. But just put that in mind, because as I'm answering these questions, I'm like, I would like to achieve all of these goals, but I'm going to focus on one and follow that train through this process. And I invite you to do this.
Oh, this is getting nitty gritty. I love this, Jackie. Thank you. Okay. You all thought you could come and listen to a webinar for an hour and a half. We're putting you to work. So let's try and get something out of the end of this. I love that, Jackie. Thank you for that invitation.
Mm,
So, first of all, thinking, why am I telling this story? What do I want my audience to do from the story?
mm,
And yeah, like Jackie has invited us to do, let's pick a goal. What is it that you want your audiences to do? Do you want them to know about something? Do you want to raise awareness? Do you want people to take up a practice that you're sharing? Do you want to welcome other allies, potential funders perhaps, or others who may help uplift your work? Do you want to recruit volunteers? Is this a lobbying action? Do you want to create some wider change? So just like we saw in the previous slides, what is this kind of transformational element that we want to achieve? What do you want people to do, or how do you want people to change? So feel free to jot down some ideas here. And if you feel inspired, we would love to welcome your thoughts in the chat. What is one thing that you would like to achieve with your storytelling? What's that change that you'd like to see in your audience, or the change that you'd like to see in the world? Feel free to answer in the chat. By the way, to let you know, as you're wonderful answers are coming in. We're going to take a little moment after this workshop to put some ideas in sticky notes into the document so we can send it around to you with lots of rich, great ideas, and you can use this as a workbook afterwards too. Great. Thank you for sharing, and please feel free to continue sharing. What are those goals you would like to achieve with your storytelling? Deepa is saying, compel people to action. Regeneration is a calling. I love this. Jackie says, storytelling to help us build an enrich community. Beautiful. Sanjana says, hi, Sanjana. Goal for storytelling is to create awareness of the world we want to inhabit, multiple social realities and contexts. I love this. Thank you so much. Feel free to keep them coming and feel free to reflect on this in your own time as well. What is it you want people to go away with? What do you want your story to do? Rogers is saying, inspire others, create positive impact, and build cohesion and interaction with other people. That's beautiful as well. How other people might relate and be affected by your stories. Thank you all so much. So we're going to move on, but feel free to keep them rolling in because we'd love to move into the next phase of this design process. So we've started by visioning, we've started by thinking about our audience and what changes we want to create in the world. And now we're moving into this observation phase, which sometimes you might hear called in a regenerative design process as mapping. So we're taking time to look, we're taking time to observe, we're taking time to jot down and map down all the resources that we have available to us. And first of all, we're going to kind of think of what we've visioned so far and boil that down to the essence of the story, where we might call the key messages. So, Jackie, how might we find the essence of the story?
So we've got some prompts here. What is it that you want to say? Why? How could you distill this to the core of your message and take out what's not needed? What is the best example you could use to illustrate your point? And what lends itself to your story? What backs up your message and what makes it clear?
Exactly. So thinking first about what you want to say and why, thinking of your work, what is a great example from your work, if it's stories of your work that you're telling, that illustrates the point you want to make? So often we start the other way around. Often we start by thinking, oh, I've done something wonderful. I want to share that wonderful thing. And I think very rightfully, we want to share our great work. But if we even before start asking, what is it that we want to say? What is the change that we want to make in our audiences or in the world? Start there first and then think about what is it that will illustrate your story and bring it to life. What has happened that could bring your story to life and be an example of this? So it is a bit of maybe it feels counterintuitive to not start with the action, not start with the kind of juice of the story, but starting first with what is it you want to say? And then thinking of any other facts that lends itself to your story and backs up your message to make it clear. So we have an observational activity in a moment. Jackie, would you like to guide us through it?
Yes. So we've broken down these things that we might want to reflect on and observe before building our story into these 6 questions. So we thought we'd run through it with an example of a fictional NGO, and then we will hand over to you and give you a chance to reflect on these points for your own context and for your own story. So James and I have created People's Harvest, which is a fictional NGO working on permaculture and working with women to grow kitchen gardens. So we're imagining that this team has done this reflection. What do they want to share? They want to share a story about women in a displacement settlement who transformed unused land into thriving permaculture kitchen gardens, improving food security, income, and community well-being. What is the goal for sharing this story? They want to inspire other communities and grassroots groups to try small-scale permaculture gardens. They also want to attract small grants or local authority support for scaling this project. Who is the audience? So based on those goals, the audience are other displaced or low-income communities and local NGOs and officials who could support or help replicate the initiative. So based on the goal in the audience, what emotion do we want to inspire? Hope, pride, and a sense of possibility, the thought that we can create abundance even here. What action do we want to inspire? We want people to contact our NGO for guidance. We want to start pilot gardens in their own spaces, and we want to share the story with others who might benefit. So who is the best person to tell the story? Perhaps going through these steps, People's Harvest, our fictional NGO, may have realized that until now, staff have been in charge of kind of writing and disseminating these stories. And actually, when we've looked at what the story is that we want to share, what the goal is, what the message and emotion is, maybe they're not the best people to have their voices captured and shared. Maybe one of the women gardeners herself, somebody who can speak from lived experience about the change in her household, her diet, and her sense of agency. So the idea is hopefully with, as James said, we often start with maybe we're reacting to a feeling or an activity and like, great, let's share this. But maybe taking a moment to really observe, maybe one of these questions might send you off on a slightly different path and maybe a slightly different path. And you may realize that you want to change something. So I would like to invite everybody to take 10 minutes to jot down some answers to this question together. Or sorry, individually, but together we'll do our own. Following this, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can shape these thoughts into a story, and there'll be time for kind of sharing and giving each other some brief feedback. But for this point, it's just getting your ideas out onto a page. So we're going to give 10 minutes to just jot down thoughts, see where this path leads you, and if any new ideas come to mind about how you can shape your story. Okay, so we'll come back in about 10 minutes and I'm going to do this as well. So maybe I can also put the questions in the chat for maybe people who can't see the screen so easily.
By the way, can you see the screen? This is such a silly question. Can you see if I've got the chat box up? Can you still see the full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Okay, we're going to give it another 4 or 5 minutes. So maybe you're working through slowly, or maybe you've answered all the questions. Maybe start from the top again. Is there anything more we could add or refine?
Just a couple more minutes to round up. Is that right? Great. So rounding up, any thoughts that you have, jotting down any final notes. And Jackie, will we have space to share?
I think some people have shared in the chat, but I think if we hold on to these thoughts for now, I think the next step in our process will help shape this into something that's going to be more impactful to share.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. I'm getting very eager. I want to hear. Don't worry, there will be time for it.
Okay. So we have observed, we've got an idea now of who we are, what story we want to tell, to whom, why. So if we move on to the next stage, we're looking at integrating. So I don't know, I think we all will have approached this in different ways, but I think starting from this idea of what we want to communicate is often quite different from what the actual story is. So here are just some thoughts about how we can put that into a story, how we can kind of begin it, end it, and have a flow. So here are some 3 stages we can think about. Where does your story start? And I think this is maybe the point at which we're taking it from what do we want to communicate to what is the story. We had a few questions earlier about what is the example you can think of that best illustrates your point? What shows this message that you're trying to communicate? And keeping in mind the other points we've reflected on who should be sharing the story, who's the voice that's speaking. So where does your story start? How do we best get to know the core ideas right from the beginning? Moving on from that, what is the middle of the story? What are the juicy bits, the main bulk of the action maybe, or the message? And finally, a strong ending. What do you want people to go away with? What is the end? Is there a clear call to action? So we can call this kind of a narrative arc or a flow of the story. And we won't rest on these questions for too long. We'll move on here. So thinking about the key takeaways of what we've just been discussing, how might you, using all of this, shape the key messages? And we've also got a little kind of useful tool tip there, Occam's razor. You may or may not have heard of this tool before, but it's a phrase for kind of a tool of speech and of communication. Occam's razor is thinking, what is the simplest way that you can communicate this? What information don't you need in order to tell the story? Can you be rid of it? So you can think of Occam's razor as a razor kind of slicing away the unnecessary and just leaving what's really crucial. So while we do want to balance this with richness and complexity, how can we balance that? It's tricky, but it's just something to keep in mind. I think especially when we like to think in holistic, integrated ways, it can be really hard to present just a story. And I think that's a stumbling block that some of us face when trying to communicate our work, because we want to paint the full integrated picture. But concisely, how can we pull together those things that we've just identified in the previous question? So
Exactly. And I think it's good to know that stories are very different from the way that we might tell in a report. So stories are not reports on your work. You're not saying this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's about shaping it in a way that might have an effect at the end. So they're very different audiences and very different ways of crafting. So I think, yeah, thank you, Jackie. You're right that Occam's razor could be a really useful tool for cutting away all those extra facts that may not be useful for the end goal of the story or what you'd like to see transform.
Sorry, could you just say, when you say think about the key takeaways of what you've learned, do you mean from the last exercise, what you've learned by working through the last exercise? Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. So the process so far, from visioning to observing, what have you learned? What's the kind of richness that you've gathered through that experience? And now in this integration stage, how do we shape that into the messages? And we're starting to create our story now, starting to create the messages in our story.
So perhaps, James, if you could move to the next slide. This is a few bullet points to kind of bring some of that together. So we'll take a few minutes now to revisit what you had sketched out in the observation activity. So that's kind of the bullet points on the left-hand side. And now trying to create some story details from this. Can we identify maybe an example if that's the type of story that you're looking at? But just reflecting on what could be the beginning, what's the middle, what's the end? How can we communicate in a way that is concise but impactful? So we'll just reflect on this for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we would like to invite a breakout activity next, where we'll be sharing some of these thoughts.
Can you say anything about what makes a good beginning? Like where do you begin a story?
So this may be different in telling stories, but I like to think of, in training, we always have this phrase, maybe you've heard it: tell them what you're going to tell them what you want to tell them what you told them. So it's about thinking of what are the key messages and how do you get them at the very beginning as well too. So what's a way of sharing the desired outcome of your story from the beginning, in the middle, and in the end? It will look different because in the in the beginning, you'll want to introduce your subject matter as well. So you'll need to think of what's happening in your story, who's the subject, how do you introduce them so that your audience understands them and understands what's going on. So you want to paint a picture of where your story is happening and the subject matter of your story. But the challenge is, how do you do that in a way that also mirrors and reflects your key messages? Maybe thinking back to this imaginary NGO that we were working with before. What were they called again, Jackie?
People's Harvest.
People's Harvest. That's so beautiful. We did look up on the internet to see whether this was a real group, and it's not. And I was so surprised because it's a great name. So thinking of People's Harvest, permaculture gardens, they wanted to inspire people to connect with them and start their own permaculture gardens. So what's the subject matter? It's probably the story of this permaculture gardener who is a kind of participant in the training. So we want to make sure that subject is introduced well and people understand the context. But we also want to inspire people about permaculture gardens from the beginning. So we might, start the story in some way that talks about the subject matter having a nutritious, gorgeous meal that she's just picked from her garden and describing the juiciness of the vegetables. And so you're kind of getting in this idea of permaculture being awesome while also talking about your subject matter. And then in the middle, maybe you're talking about a challenge that she's overcome or her process of learning. And the end, maybe about this wider transformation of how other people are going to learn from this. That's just off the top of my head. Did that answer your question, Maddie, kind of?
Yeah, that helps. Yeah. Yeah, it does.
I guess a short, annoying answer is there's no one answer. And however feels right for your story.
And maybe reflecting on stories that really impacted you. And maybe this time, if you're looking at, for example, sharing the story of someone you've worked with in your work, think of times when you've come up with anything that stood out to you. I think for me, the kind of example James described resonates with the things that usually have impacted me. Often it starts right in the moment of maybe the impact, or, someone's excited to share or show the impact. And then it kind of chronologically goes back a little bit to what the problem is, how that solution was reached, but gives you like a taste of like, this is the change, this is, what we want to communicate. And it looks different in loads of different ways. We all shared types of stories in the chat that were really different from each other. And I think the beginning does really depend on what the goal is and what the audience is. But we'll have time to discuss our individual ones in a minute. So maybe you can get some tailored feedback there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I also think it depends on the medium through which you're telling the story. And we're going to dive more into that in a moment too.
Yeah, great.
Really good question.
Okay, I know we could spend a lot more time refining this, but for the purpose of this session, I think we should move on. Next, we'd like to invite a breakout activity. So I'm going to generate some breakout rooms of 2 people each, and I invite the first person to share your story in 1 to 2 minutes using the answers to the previous questions, in just a bullet pointed, informal way. This is what I'm imagining. If you already have ideas about the format that would take, if it's visual or writing, feel free to include that. If not, we'll talk about that a little bit next. And then after you've shared for 1 to 2 minutes, I'd like the person who listened to you to give you 2 pieces of feedback. I'd like them to highlight something that was effective, something that impacted them or they thought was really well done. And I'd like them to think, if they can, of one way your story and what you've just shared could be strengthened. And then, of course, we invite you to swap and share the same things back, and make sure when you're listening, you're really actively listening. What stands out to you? So give me a moment and I'll set the breakout rooms.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was useful. I know breakout rooms are never long enough, so I'm sure some people were cut off mid-sentence, and I'm so sorry. I wish we had more time.
We also tried to give a halfway guidance, and then we realized we sent that to the wrong place. So you you probably got just shoved out there with no guidance. So
No warning, but I hope it was useful. We'd love to invite some thoughts in the chat. How did you find that process? How did you find sharing your story so far? And also, how did you find listening, actively listening to those stories? What came up for you? So we'd love to invite just a couple of words of reflection in the chat, and feel free to keep them coming as we move along. So we have flowed through a design process so far, starting with visioning, then observing and mapping. We're integrating all that knowledge together. And now we come to the very rich part of creating. So this is where we start to pull everything together, start doing whatever we're doing, whether it's taking photos, whether it's taking videos, whether it's writing, whatever our medium may be. This is where it all starts to happen. But we have to start by thinking about the story that we've created thus far. So thinking on the story and who's in it and who's telling it, maybe there is a medium that really best lends itself to this story. For example, maybe it's a community who are amazing storytellers and love speaking. And maybe you think, this would lend itself so well to a conversational podcast. Or maybe you think this is a community who are wonderful at telling stories, but actually this is best in writing and as a blog or a news article. So thinking first about what is the medium that best lends itself to your story, and maybe that is multiple ones. Maybe you're thinking this could be a great written piece and a video. We've already thought a bit about our audience, and this can help us shape what medium this becomes. So if we think we really want people to engage with how our permaculture gardens are so green and so biodiverse and so abundant, well, you can't really see those green, abundant permaculture gardens just in writing. So you definitely want to do something over video or with photography. So if you're wanting to inspire people through the visuals, and you know the audience really react well to videos, then that's already made some decisions for you. And of course, thinking about the accessibility for your ideal audience. Another very important question is, who is the person making the story, or rather editing the story? And what's their capacity, or what's your capacity? Because say, for example, you're a great writer, but you've never done film before, well, then maybe it's good to start with writing and practice film. So thinking about your own capacity and your own passions, and maybe that helps with a deciding factor as well. Or maybe it helps you find someone else who can help coach and guide you through something new. So we have some questions just for you to reflect on at this stage. We're not going to dive super deeply into them at this moment, but a reminder that this is going to be a worksheet that we'll share around with you after as well. So thinking first about the platforms on which you want to share. So say, for example, if it's a video, then you'll probably want to share it on a platform like Vimeo or YouTube. What is the target audience? And how might you best reach them? What speaks to them? And one way to find this is to do a bit of market research, as it were, or a bit of research into what other videos are there out there, if you're doing it by video as an example, what already exists and what has the most views, or what are some really high impact things that you've seen that are really seem to be resonating, and maybe there's some learning there for you. And then we start to think of the tools that can help you create that content. And we're going to go specifically into some more specific mediums in later workshops, but we wanted to share some materials for you in a moment about principles of design. Again, we're not going to go into these in depth now, but we're going to share this with you to reflect on afterwards. So for example, if you're doing something visual, whether that be photography, film, or visual graphic design, here are some principles that can help you create that. Here are some principles of written storytelling that can help you shape your stories. And here's some principles of audio storytelling if you're thinking of things like podcasts or audio, with a couple of other tips at the bottom as well. So these, I hope, I hope they're useful for you, and we can dive more deeply into them in future sessions as well. But they're just some tips as you go along with either visual, written, or audio pieces of work. So as you start to create, here are some principles that can help you create. Jackie, it's very important to continue evaluating and evolving your work. Do you want to say anything on this?
Yes, exactly. As James said, we're not going into each of these really deeply, but once you've created your story, but even before sharing, you want to evaluate, again, thinking of your goals, thinking of your audience, thinking of your capacity, all of these things. How well does your communications align with that? How well does your communications align with your ethics? Which is one thing we've only spoken on briefly, but in future, we want to go more deeply into all these topics, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And once you've shared it, how exactly sharing and this kind of evaluation, I think, are a cycle that keep feeding into one another. Once you've shared it, how do you know if your call to action has been achieved? Are there ways that you can kind of track and look at the impact of one story versus another, whether that's number of people who've responded to you and joined your initiative after they've heard your story, or even really practically on things like social media. If you're creating posts on Facebook, you can now see the impact and the reach that one post has versus another. So if we go back to sharing as well, When we're talking about platforms and format, we're already thinking about the places and the ways in which we're sharing. And it also can be worthwhile to think about things like what's the best time to share, whether that's a time of the week or a time of the year, or associated with maybe Earth Day or a Christmas fundraising appeal is a kind of thing that's quite common in the UK. When will people best receive and engage with your message? And also in terms of sharing, who can be your allies in amplifying your story? If, as I tried to mention earlier, as you're developing your own stories, maybe it's something that's super relevant to the rest of the Realliance community. Maybe we can be your ally and put it in our newsletter, or, you know, share it word of mouth. And I think that's a really useful thing to think about. How can you, you know, create more impact for minimum effort? So that brings us very briefly over the last few steps of this kind of design process. Maddie's already written in the chat that we've just scratched the surface. James and I agree completely. We've gone quite quickly over the creating portion in particular, and we think that if we're thinking of many of our members who suggested this session, a lot of our members in particular are working in contexts of displacement, where even in addition to all the usual questions we might have around the ethics of capturing and sharing stories, there are a lot of more real practical elements as well about, you know, consent, the way that you approach communities, safeguarding risks, all sorts of different things. This is really, in some instances, really like a complex thing that we want to do very carefully. And so we don't really have time to do everything justice in only an hour and a half. And James and I were intending to offer, to see what the feeling is, if another follow-up session on the more practical side, things that would answer some more of kind of the questions that Maddie's put in the chat as well, of, you know, exactly how personal, what if it's this situation, what if it's that situation? So while we don't have time to really refine stories together in this session, James and I are very open to contributing further sessions. We had a loose storytelling circle that met regularly last year. And yeah, whether we do a more structured session with activities like this, or more of kind of a peer space for just connection and sharing and learning and that kind of solidarity, we always want to be led by members and what you guys want. So this session came out of hearing a call, that's what people want, and let us know what you would like. So that brings us to the end of that design session. We don't really have time to go into each different thing. So I feel that many people who've been following along may have the beginning of the story, knowing what you want to do, and now it's just the practical creating it and sharing it that's left. So unfortunately, that kind of brings us to most of what we have time for today, but there's an open invitation that this conversation can continue. So I'd love to hear any final thoughts, any reflections, what more you want to see, and how we can continue to try and serve all the incredible work that you're all doing.